Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Music Theory Logic. My name's Andrew, and today's going to be another music theory breakdown. Today, I'm excited to show you a huge track from a house music icon. Today, we're looking at On Your Mind by Kaskade. Let's go ahead into the Logic session. Here we are in my rendition of On Your Mind by Kaskade. If you haven't seen one of these before, I basically have done my best to recreate the instrumental from the ground up. I do most of these by ear. So I'm aiming to get all of the notes right. I try to pick sounds that are as close as possible to the original in a reasonable amount of time. I do not play the original audio since I do not own the copyright. If you haven't heard this track, I encourage you to pause this and go check out the original On Your Mind by Kaskade. Without further ado, here is my rendition. No vocals, but that would be here. A little empty without the vocals, I will admit. Here comes that bass. hopefully you enjoyed that, and if you're a fan of that track, hopefully it sounded close enough to continue watching this. So without further ado, let's get into the music theory. So music theory involves scales and chords, and this song is written using the scalar in the key of B natural minor. B natural minor has two black keys. It has C sharp and F sharp. It has the same notes, or its relative major is D major. If you haven't gotten my text linked below, you could easily write the most basic minor key from A to A, and drag it up a whole step all the way to B, and you would get those notes. Let's hear that scale. Cool. Now I'm going to get into the bass line, which is the predominant melodic or moving sort of sound from the whole track. We obviously have a melody, but I mean, the bass line is the most active and changing. The chord stuff that we have going on is somewhat minimal, but it's an interesting harmony. We have a B sus2 chord. That's what I would call this. We're basically using the first note, the fifth note, and the second note from the scale. So it's those three pitches. Notice we don't even have the minor third in there. This makes it sound, it's a really cool chord. I like it a lot. If we were to add the third in, we would call this a ninth, but I like to call these sus2s when we're replacing the third with the second. Here's that chord. Cool. So let's get into this track. So the drums are pretty straightforward, although there's a lot of nuance, and the kick drum sounds amazing like most of his work. But basically, house music, my definition, involves a 4-on-the-floor kick drum pattern. So our kick is on every quarter note. We're working at 108 beats per minute, so a little bit slower than some house music we find, which typically I'm thinking around like 124 or 128. We get a standard hi-hat for this kind of music. It's on the every other eighth note, or the upbeat. We have a clap that is happening on beat 2 and beat 4. And then finally, for the drums, there's kind of this cool thing where I printed this closed hi-hat and then I reversed it. So if you listen to the original, you're going to hear like a lead into the cymbal, which is a really cool effect. Basically, all I did was duplicate that, reverse it, speed that up, and all together, those drums sound like this. Oh, let's start it from the beginning. Cool. I'll address some changes to the drums from like left to right as we go throughout this track. Let's cover the chord stuff. So I already showed you this chord in the beginning. We have it on a pad instrument. It's happening every measure. And then we also have it on this vocal sound. It's happening on a quarter note and then the following 2 eighth notes. So the pad sounds like this with those drums. And then with the vocal pad added, it's this. Cool. I think that provides quite a nice like ambiance or area for the track. The next thing we have that's pitched is the guitar sound. This I recorded. That's why it's blue in Logic. That is audio. I'm literally playing the note B. I was playing it at the 4th fret on the G string. For those of you that know how to tune your guitar from like one note being correct, that's how we tune the B string. So I'm just playing that note on what is essentially steady eighth notes with a little bit of swing in there. That all together sounds like this. There's the guitar. That with the other 2 layers that we just talked about, we get this. So that is our full introduction. That happens for 4 bars before the bass line begins. So let's go to the bass line. Those of you stumbling across this video are probably most looking forward to this. I don't blame you. So couple things. One, when the bass starts, we get the 4 bars of just holding the 1. It's kind of like, or I guess 8 bars of just holding the 1. The same rhythm that we're going to get and see when the bass line really gets going, but it's not until 12 measures through this song that this comes in with the bass line changing. So let's first talk about the rhythm. It starts out on the 1, that's the B. Looks like this. Cool. So a couple things. One, we're on the 1 note. That's important. 2, the actual bass line has a really cool second syncopated part. It really reminds me of Another One Bites the Dust. I don't know if you guys got that vibe too. Not the beginning, but another one bites the dust. Reminiscent of it, not exactly the same rhythm. But we find that in all sorts of music. And that makes sense because music is like this oral language or this audio language that all music begins with something in the past and continues it, and there is similarity all of the time, especially if you know how to look for it via some music theory stuff. So the rhythm of that is on the first 2 quarter notes, on the third quarter note, so first 3 in a row, the last 16th of the first measure, then 2 eighth notes in a row. We skip beat 2, go to the second 8th note after beat 2, and then we get 3 and 4. This pattern repeats every other measure, and again, it's going to repeat once we get the full bass line. Cool, let's go and look at the full bass line. So after we hold that 1 in the beginning of the song, we start to get the bass movement. It's really kind of a cool moment when we first hear this E note because nothing else in the music has changed to tell us that that's going to happen. So it's kind of like this nice surprise. And since those notes come from the key, it works extra well. So the bass line is using the same rhythm I just showed you. That's right there. It does that rhythm for each of the bass notes that we go through. We start on the 1, we go up to the 4, that's an E. We then go up to a minor 6, that is our G. Then we go to a minor 7, that's our A. Sounds like this. I'll let you watch the MIDI while we listen. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about the sound design. So since house music and electronic music, EDM in general, so much of the important stuff is done in the sound design, and part of the sound of this bass line comes from the actual patch. So instead of coming through presets forever, I built it from scratch or with my ear. A couple things to highlight. One, I'm not even using oscillator B, volume's off, so that might as well not be there. I'm doing some filtering with the LFO, which is important, so that's on a standard half note. I haven't changed the shape at all. Then I have it more rounded out. This is the bend minus. That's what gives it kind of a little of that talking or that tonal change. And notice since both of these are a half note, we only get that when we hold the bass note for longer. Finally, I'm doing something here on the envelope, just kind of slow, not getting it to hold the note the whole time, but have kind of a release. Then using a really subtle amount of soft clip, going into compression. The EQ, I'm basically just turning down the top shelf. I automate this to come up later in the song, so that's important. And then finally, I'm filtering it again with the low pass filter. I'm using the MG Low 6 filter in Serum, and I have the second LFO that was controlling the other filter tied to that cutoff as well. Cool. The final piece of information we need for our bass line is the pitch bend. So at the end of every note, essentially, the end of 2 measures, we get this pitch bend up sound. You probably noticed it's very subtle. You'll notice. So that little pitch bend goes a long way. I've talked about pitch bends in all sorts of these videos. We find a lot of pitch bends in music, especially in a really subtle amount. We saw them on a lot of the trap, like flutes for Future and 2 Chainz, those kind of beats, and a bunch of other ones that are escaping me right now. Cool. So that covers the bass line. That's essentially happening the entire song that we get bass. The only real difference is that I'm changing how it fits in the mix. So I have the EQ rolled off for the bottom of that sub until we get to the main drop section. So you're not hearing anything below 90 hertz in the intro or when the bass starts. Cool. That essentially covers everything. So we get to this next section where we have the main first drop. That's where we get the lead melody. I had a little trouble trying to replicate that melody sound, so I am using an Arturia sort of synth. What is it? Like a synth brass sound. Let's see if this loads up. So yeah, we're using the CZ by Arturia. Cool, and then I have that layered with a default Logic trumpet. The notes for this melody also use all the notes from our B natural minor. Not all of them, but only notes from B natural minor. So we're going from the 1 up to the 3. So that's B up to D. We repeat that. There is our minor third for a second. So that in conjunction with the chord that we have that I showed you before gives us that sort of what I was calling a minor 9 chord sound. So that's somewhat important. We're going up from 1 to 3, 3, 3, steady eighth notes, and then hitting the 2 back down to 1. That's our C sharp. Then we go down to the minor 7. That's A. That's over here. And then we go back to the 1. And then we have a different ending where we this time hit D on our way up to E. So that note is in our bass line. That's the 4. So we're going 3 up to 4, back down to 3. We hit 2 twice, and then finally down to 1. Let's hear that. I'll solo that, and then I'll unsolo it so we can hear the instrumental with it. Cool, and I'll unsolo that. So here's the beat. Cool. So that covers the melody. Again, it's the same notes on the bottom. I'm just using 2 channels to try to recreate the sound. Finally, this bottom line, you guessed it, there's some pitch bend. It's really subtle. It goes a long way to making this feel even more organic or analog. It's really just happening at the beginning of movement to the next note transition. Cool. So then we get our breakdown, or the middle of the section. This is where we hear that plucked synth for the first time. It's like a pitched percussive sound. That is this thing. That sound, which again is not exact to the song, but that is playing a B, so it's the 1. Again, which makes total sense. Then we get our plucked chord sound that is using basically the 1 and the 1 and the 5 in a pattern. We hit the 1 and 3 once. So this is all on the 1 chord, the first 2 4 measures. The second 4 measures go through like the bass line did at the very end, from the minor 6 up to the minor 7. These are octaves, parallel octaves running together. Cool. And again, this sounds like quite an empty section without the vocal, but this is what it sounds like. Here comes that minor 6. Cool, so let's hear that continue with the bass. Cool. I'll talk about that next. Sound. So there's this really cool sort of like trippy bit crusher percussive sort of sound that happens at the end of that build-up or this breakdown into the last final drop. What I did was I bounced the above layer, that pitched percussion I showed you playing the note B in place. I then added a bunch of effects. It looks like I've got a filter going into some tape delay, into a bit crusher, into vocal transformer, into the H delay, into little alter boy to push down the pitch and the formats. And then finally, I'm low passing all of that. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty proud of it accomplishing the same thing. And then by automation, I have that low pass filter opening up. That's what feels like that build-up instrument as the section progresses. You can really hear the harmonic from that channel coming out. Cool. Then it's the final drop section. There's nothing different that happens except for, I guess, one percussion sound I haven't talked about. We have a shaker. I'm using a good, like, super old school Vengeance House 1 shaker loop 10 for that I stretched to be in time. It seems like exactly like the one in the song, so perhaps somebody needed that tip out there. So the only difference in this final section is we get the shaker that comes in, and then it's going through a bunch of tape delay, and that's kind of a weird, trippy sound effect in the final drop. You'll notice it in the original if you go back and listen to it. Cool. And then finally, an additional percussion sound that is kind of like a digital cowbell of sorts. That sound. And it is doing a pattern that repeats every measure. Let's zoom that in so you can see it better. Cool pattern. That's like 1 and 2 and 3 E 4. Da 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 da. So essentially, music theory, or how we would teach counting 16th notes, we would say 1 E and So I kind of hold every one of these boxes as one of those spaces. So for moving from left to right, this would be like 1 E. We don't say because we're not playing it. And 2. We're not playing that E. We're playing and, not the Then 3 E. So that's where those syllables come from. So that's an example of where some music theory really goes a long way. So most musicians, when they're learning to count 16th notes or 8th notes, learn to count them the same way. So most musicians I've come in contact with or I've worked with, if they are familiar with what a 16th note is, then they'll know we count it that way. It makes it a lot easier when you're talking about a rhythm. Like, I think that rhythm, the right after 2E and feels like out of time or something. So music can be difficult to talk about because it's sound, which is why theory and some of these words that are commonly used in the vernacular of musicians are super helpful to know, especially since we don't, work in vacuums, and chances are, no matter who you are, if you continue in music, you'll eventually be working with someone else, and if you can efficiently communicate with one another, you will be a lot more efficient in general. So cool. We'll go ahead and call it there. Hopefully you found this video to be helpful. We looked at On Your Mind by Kaskade. It's not a brand new record, but it's something that I've been hearing a ton. It's definitely a really, really famous track, and hopefully you learned a little bit about maybe B natural minor. We saw a really tasteful sort of production where there's not a lot of crazy stuff happening at the same time, but it's really interesting how he brings elements in and out that makes for really a much more interesting experience when we're listening to the track. It also allows him to perform the track in different ways as in his DJ sets. So if you found this helpful, you would help me out a ton by subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell for notifications. If you do, you'll see when I make a new video. Right now, we're coming out with a video every Tuesday on stories that should help those of you in creative fields. And then on Fridays, these music theory breakdowns. And I'm trying to cover a bunch of different genres and types of music. If you have any songs that you would like to see me cover, leave them in the comments. I look forward to a challenge. Cheers and have a great day. See you guys next time.